so that we have practical understanding of the relationship between subject and object. It would be good to speak about what it actually represents. In other words, where is this idea of division comes from? What is the basis behind our experience of duality itself? Because if we have adopted this particular philosophical ground, then it cannot be just taken on some kind of vague understanding or some kind of trust that here is unity and here is duality, and somehow they sit together, somehow it must make sense. What makes something into a philosophical ground, into the ground for understanding, into a philosophical system, when there is has to be some clarity in terms of exposition, and that has to make sense to our experience. And this is what philosophy is all about. It's explaining, or trying to explain, making attempts to explain what we otherwise all experience, but not from the gross plane of just sensory or mental modifications, but how it can be sitting and essentially in terms of the structure of the macrocosmos and microcosmos, because everything that we experience outwardly makes sense only on the account that there is a recognition. Anything that we experience, old or new, only makes sense because it's being recognized. It's being literally cognized. Therefore, we speak of cognition. Every act is an act of cognition. But what is happening? Why? This question could be repeatedly asked. Why, if the underlying reality of all things is held and empowered by that unified field of consciousness, why can there be experience of separation, or the experience of what we call duality? Why would there be even this experience of subject and object? I just want to know if that is a logical question.
Yes.
Yes.
For sure.
Like, why would that be? The underlying ground of consciousness, it's all there is. Why there is this visceral, direct experience of me and the other?
Because of the consciousness plane.
Yes, absolutely, it plays, but we cannot just brush it or give it.
As a preschool teacher, the children have to do that. Every child, they're not normal if they don't develop that. There's something, that's what humans do.
Develop?
The first thing little babies do when they're coming out of their inner world is learn to point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but why would that break down consciousness? Why would that break down our awareness into the experience of duality? Because don't forget that if we accept at some point, or welcome or embrace, that the ground of creation is unified field, we're not speaking now from a materialistic perspective. This is given. So we are invited immediately to speak about consciousness from the perspective of this monistic, or from the quantum understanding, where consciousness is a unified field. From that perspective, it makes no difference, a newborn baby, an old lady, an old man, a new man, it makes no difference whatsoever. It makes no difference even what kind of physiology that is. It makes no difference what education and so forth. These are all surface values. Why is the experience of duality? This is what we're addressing here. What creates rupture between subject and object? So in order to dive into this, and just as the relationship between Prakasha and Vimarsha exemplifies that creative tension between awareness and the power to be aware of itself, or the luminosity of consciousness beholding its own brilliance. Without this understanding, it will be very difficult to even contemplate on the values that are being, where the tantric teaching essentially is expounded from. In the same way, the following is indispensable part, and that is exemplified by the internality and the externality. It's that internal and external, and this is what we're going to talk about. Even if just to give us an idea and more understanding, what does it mean? So, what subject essentially is the internal dimension of awareness. Subject exemplifies internal aspect of awareness. It is internal, never-changing aspect of awareness. An object represents the extroverted, external aspect of awareness. When consciousness or awareness is withdrawn into its internal aspect, the thought pattern ceases to exist. All this, what is otherwise called vrittis or vikalpas, cease to exist. This is the state of nirvikalpa. Awareness without any modification of thought. Consciousness contemplates itself only as being. It knows itself only as subject. And soon as the propensity to go outward, as it were, it immediately assumes the form of an object that it projects out of itself and illumines at the same time. But in doing so, when consciousness is drawn out of itself, out of its internalized aspect, into the so-called external reality of its own manifestation, it is experienced at the expense of its internal reality. And this pendulum, or this movement between the inner and the outer, is the very basis behind the supreme doctrine of Spanda. Spanda here simply stands for the throb or quiver, a tremor within awareness itself. So that internal and that external are the aspects of awareness which creates the division between subject and object. When consciousness is projected out of itself through its own will, out of its own will and power to create, it manifests itself as an object of its own contemplation. And loses, as it were, temporarily awareness of its internal dimension. Moreover, what we call being is the very internal or internalized dimension of our reality, of our utmost reality. That unchangeable being. And that extroverted movement is that eternal becoming. So consciousness, our awareness, is at once being and becoming. Becoming here is that perpetual outpouring of awareness out of its plenitude. And becoming is a creative power of awareness to express itself through infinitude reality of forms and phenomena. So therefore, two aspects of consciousness here are eternal. Being is eternal and becoming is eternal. This becoming is a creative act. An act of self-expression. and the outpouring of awareness is spoken of in yogic and tantric and Vedic lore as that spontaneous emission. Yes?
So, just before we move on, you're explaining where this rupture between subject and object occurs. And you said that essentially this external experience is had at the expense of the internal experience of being. But then there's this state of consciousness of bheda abheda, which maintains the perception of unity, even in that perception of diversity. So this still doesn't explain what you said, still doesn't explain where the rupture comes from, because you can have, in that state of bheda abheda, there isn't a rupture anymore, but multiplicity is still experienced.
Yes.
So,
because there is no rupture. It seems as if there is a rupture. So just hold your horses.
okay.
We'll come to that. There are still different levels of awareness. And we spoke about bheda, bheda abheda, and abheda. But in relation to this, what I'd like to emphasize, what would be good for you to contemplate on, is that internal versus external, the internal aspect of awareness versus external aspect of awareness. It is everyone's experience.
Okay.
It is everyone's experience. It is now. It is always. And to understand this, not as some discrepancy or some fault in consciousness, or as some very sophisticated philosophical systems, other philosophical systems, explain this as a phenomena belonging to illusion. For example, from the Vedantic perspective, from the perspective of the Advaita Vedanta, what is responsible for this misconception is that one becomes temporarily subjected to Maya. And Maya is seen here as the superimposition on Brahman, or superimposition on awareness, which essentially has no substance behind its existence. Therefore it is called and dismissed as illusion. So Maya here is only spoken of in case of this perspective known as Advaita Vedanta as an illusion, superimposition. It has no substance in it whatsoever. And moreover, we spoke about it earlier, it's causal as well. It's something to overcome. From the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism, or the philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism, Maya is seen in a different light. Maya is the power of creative impulse. Maya is the power to create. It's the very svatantriya, freedom to create. Moreover, that freedom to create and Maya are one and the same. In other words, you can give you a worldly example. It's like absolute is as an artist lost in a creative act. Awareness in a playful act of creativity loses awareness of itself, as it were, temporarily, just as an artist does in every domain, whether it's a dancer, musician, painter, anyone. Artist here spoken universally. In fact, we can then turn that metaphor and say that that is why that experience is there, because that experience is a replica of what is actually happening.
The experience of losing yourself
in the act. Yes.
fractal
Exactly.
replication of the universal.
So this is a positive perspective on why awareness loses its power to hold this in utter unity. In other words, all this, what we're experiencing, all this, what we're experiencing, is nothing other than creative genius of our own awareness.
This is the becoming that you're speaking.
Yes. And that, where you asked the question, was linked to the tantric understanding of the spontaneous emission. That spontaneous emission, that outpouring, speaking in terms of the anatomy of that process, exemplified by the outpouring of the supremely subtle category of the pranav, of the outpouring of that primordial sound. The connotation of that in terms of our own anatomy is that bindu visarga. The bindu visarga corresponds to a place of origination where from a dot of singularity the diversity pours out. The diversity pours out of our own being in terms of purity, pure, unobstructed sound. And this outpouring is not something that happens in space-time. That's what creates space-time, but it is beyond time and space, just as becoming itself beyond time and space. Therefore, becoming is not and cannot be understood in terms of becoming from point A to point B. It's a continuous becoming. It is a continuous outpouring. And this is our experience. This is a true validity of our experience in as much as this philosophical platform allows us to talk about it. So in other words, just as you ponder on that, on the question, even to speak about creation loses its meaning. There is no such thing as creation, because creation presupposes that something has the beginning, an intermediate state, and therefore could have its end. From this perspective, from this point of view, there is no such thing as the first day of creation. The first day of creation is at every instant. That the perpetual outpouring is that what really this reality is, and that what makes it seamless. Our human experience, of course, is subjected to the very experience locked in the dimension of space-time. And the linearity here comes unquestioned, unchallenged. But that is being re-evaluated when we directly experience the cessation of any vrittis, because really the world is also here, is a byproduct of our mind. It's a thought construct. This is where Kashmir Shaivism shares its perspective with the teachings we can find in some of the great sages of our time, like Ramana Maharshi or Buddha. This whole world is a byproduct of the mind. It's a byproduct of the thought. When thought ceases, subject abides in itself. Awareness abides in its universal I-ness. It abides in its universal centrality of the I. This is, by definition, is that universal ego.
Why is the illusion of separation so dominant if we are pure awareness?
This answer to that is very simple. But it's like you are invited to have a very radical departure, perhaps from everything you have contemplated or known before. The illusion of separation you speak of, or we speak of, is nothing other than creative expression of your own awareness, which willingly conceals itself from its own nature in the act of that creative outpouring, and in the same way finds a thrill in recovering itself. And that is, by definition, spanda. That movement outward and in is the throb of awareness. That is the quiver at the heart of it all.
Wow. That's quite beautiful.
And it is beautiful. I completely share that. It's an integral understanding where we no longer abide in any remnants of outlived perspectives and paradigms, of whether they are based on some religious hang-ups of separation, nor even in some of the New Agey concepts of ignorance. There is no such thing as ignorance. All this is a throb of consciousness, throb of our own awareness. That movement outward and movement back in. This being and becoming at once. In the act of becoming, our being is not lost. But it appears as so because it's continuously becoming something else. It's continuously expressing itself. There is no end to that power of self-expression. There's no beginning to that either. This unfathomable relationship between being and becoming is the very quiver, the throb of our awareness. And that throb of our awareness, what creates the division. In order for unity to express itself as diversity, for the sake of its own enjoyment. And all the drama that comes in between, of course, is just thrown there to spice the life. Just as we often speak that we will not call it a drama and we will never go to theater or to the movie if there is no drama. The simple examples given is if you want to go and watch a true non-duality drama or true non-duality film, be prepared to watch
The blank screen.
A blank screen. Yeah.
See
Wow.
the screen.
how much fun there is. I much prefer Brad Pitt.
You explaining that in that way just now was such a relief to me, because I feel like I've been working or trying so hard to remain in a unity consciousness, and it's fairly difficult. But there's absolutely nothing wrong.
It's a total freedom.
It is so beautiful. Oh my God. Oh. Oh. Thank you. Wow. Oh. Oh. Ah. Thank you.
All glory to your own self, most intimate self.